back to democracy in globalized societies. So there is a crisis of global action and decision-making about collective action problems that we have across countries. One of them is climate change. There is poverty, there is increasing fights about resources, and our global institutional bodies that would come to realizing some kind of transnational democracy are failing or fainting. The UN, the European Union, they have been lamed by disagreement. So nothing is happening. Democracy is failing. Citizens are protesting, and they have been protesting for about 20 years the crisis of neoliberal global economy. And there has been also a financial and an economic crisis that hasn't really led to any changes in global decision making. There is no shifting. And so in this situation, this what I call a global inaction crisis has led to local polarization. Countries are getting increasingly unequal. People have a lot of fear, the middle classes, of losing everything. And in that moment, migrants arrive, forced migrants from the countries where climate change, like in Syria, for example, where it didn't rain for a couple of years before protests started. People are arriving from these places, refugees, people who try to find places where they could have a future. So now you have also increased linguistic and cultural diversity in those Western societies that already feel threatened by economic crisis and by often a crisis of institutional democracy. And in that situation, you have two tendencies that are interesting for analysis. One is right-wing backlash and the mobilization of fear towards that linguistic or cultural diversity and pressure put on immigrants to integrate, but it's really not clear what that actually means and whether they can do it. And on the other side, you have solidarity with those affected by the crises, by the multiple crises. It all condenses here in this picture of a civic assembly in Hamburg in the summer of 2015, where refugees debated together with locals in a multilingual atmosphere. My research is interested whether and to what extent democracy can work in societies in these crisis moments, since we're going to have multiple waves of migration, according to the UN perspectives about climate change and other issues in different localities. So how can people who are very diverse, some of them coming with trauma, others coming from different backgrounds, how can they work together? So what I did in the past 15 years is study the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum is a global grassroots democracy experiment. It's been created by global justice activists. These are environmentalists, peace activists, feminists, farmers movement, workers, unemployed movement, landless peoples movement. So all kinds of progressives, but they disagree often with each other. For example, the anarchists and the traditional leftists, the unionists. And they worked together in the forum, and they did so in a radically diverse setting using consensus as their decision making. That method of democracy has been called grassroots discursive or deliberative democracy. And in the social forum process, its basis is cultural diversity as a starting point for dialogue. And so I was interested, together with many other scholars, how the World Social Forum would work, where its decisions or its processes were inclusive and where they weren't, where it was more egalitarian or less. And a lot of scholars before me predicted that, oh, well, it's going to be the most democratic in the small local social forum groups or in the national ones where people can understand each other, speak the same language. And that's also what democratic theory predicts, thinking about global democracy. So a lot of scholars in political science have been assuming that talking to people who speak another language than your own is difficult. Trying to make effective, fair, democratic decisions with them should be even harder. And in the book, I show to the opposite, based on an empirical finding that political translation practices turn linguistic and cultural diversity into a tool for democracies to become more democratic, more inclusive, egalitarian, and transparent, even in unequal contexts. It's an empirically based hypothesis, and the book makes that argument in 4 chapters, looking at national, transnational, and local settings where people work together, either in settings that were culturally homogeneous or in settings that were diverse culturally and partly also linguistically. So I brought a couple of book copies if you're interested um, in this. So how did what I call political translation in the World Social Forum work? So there was a practical need, a functional need for activists to just be able to understand each other. So people from all different groups volunteered and founded the Babels Network. My colleague Julie Boury has written about the Babels. The Babels was an activist or is an activist collective of interpreters and translators. I will call them translators, following Moira Inghileri's way of using translation and interpretation interchangeably, because translation also refers to the cultural and transformative potential of interpreting work. But the people who founded Babels, the majority of them were students of simultaneous interpreting. So they call themselves interpreters. And one of them said, I quote, "The idea to found Babels came up when, in an international meeting, a woman from Kyrgyzstan from a human rights organization made a statement. She became more and more desperate. She talked for half an hour. All listened, but nobody understood. That's why we, as students of simultaneous interpretation, created Babels." End of quote. So you have this empathetic and practical thing. We want to just make possible dialogue in different languages. But what's really interesting, soon the character of translating and interpreting changes. Here is, for example, the quote by Carla, who was not an interpreter who would sit in the back of the meeting interpreting simultaneously for the participants. She was the one who was facilitating meeting, standing in the front. She was deciding about who gets the ticket paid to meet together. And she also used the notion of translation to talk about democracy in the US Social Forum. When I interviewed Carla to ask her why the American Social Forum was so successful in including people of color and white working class people, as well as more upper middle class participants, how they were able to include a wide variety of transgender and queer people, she said, "We use translation." And I said, "What translation? Like the Europeans do, the bubbles?" And she said, "No." And this is a quote. I quote, "It's not just about linguistic translation. It's a translation of space, of gender, of bringing in queer folks, people of color. It means changing that face of who the left is." End of quote. So Carla here talks about a new model of democracy that has nothing to do with a neutral position of interpreter trying to make decision-making possible in a diverse group. She talks about something that sounds more like affirmative action. But more than affirmative action, it's a political struggle for translation, where meetings should be more diverse. So it's a political conception and it's a set of practices. So why does she use translating for that notion? She herself is bilingual, and she's been working for US philanthropic foundations to bring together Democrats from Washington, D.C. with local migrants and undocumented workers, and local churches in the US South, the Bible ladies, she called them, as well as queer youth of color. So her translating work is both multilingual, but it also has to do with translating gender, sexuality, and translating class, so that the people from DC can communicate to the local workers. And for her, that was an intrinsic political job. So for those of you who do translation studies, that's nothing new. For political scientists, it is. So in that sense, I define in this book political translation based on the empirical practices that activists in the US, in Europe, and in South Africa have been using in different contexts to translate. Political translation goes beyond the practice of linguistic interpreting in the strict sense to translate and confront or address differences of class, culture, gender, ethnicity, nationality. You can think about ability, disability, and others. And what political translators do, in my definition, and in this book, which is ethnographic, is they address positional misunderstandings. These misunderstandings aren't misunderstandings about symbols that are read differently in different languages. They are about failures of communication based on structural inequalities. So as an example, in Hungary, when you say yes, you sometimes nod your head like that. That would be misunderstood in this country. So it's not about these type of misunderstandings. It's about a misunderstanding where one group doesn't want to share its resources with other groups equally. So just imagine, for example, a cake. We are all hungry, or this is a really delicious cake. And some have traditionally gotten a lot of pieces and others less. So those who got less, they make an argument for justice and equality. They want more. But those who always got more say, no, you have no right to get more because we always got more. And that's totally legit. And they have a narrative to legitimize that. Now you have a political struggle about the cake. And these are positional misunderstandings. And what I noticed empirically, and the book is full of anecdotes about is that even people who want to make democracy work, who want to work together with people who have less, when it's about the piece of cake, they're gonna stick to having their bigger share, and they will not understand. So you have something that's a misunderstanding that's a little bit unconscious or half conscious. I call it preconscious, an element of blindness that is very recurrent in political processes. And so political translators are people who intervene in these situations as a critical third group, and they disrupt them. And I'll talk now about how they do that. So among others, they teach influential group members and leaders to listen to others more carefully and take them seriously. So it's not just listen more carefully, but also if you don't listen, we're gonna disrupt the meeting. So these are critical activist translators. One group that use political translation are the Bubbles that I mentioned, but there are also community translators in California, community organizers, and volunteers in Europe in the refugee solidarity movement who use its practices. So in the presentation, I'm going to ask whether political translation is a model for deliberative conflict resolution in diverse societies. And I'll base my argument on the comparison of radical democracy and social movements and mainstream democracy, where people also try to use political translation with mixed success in California. My starting point is democratic theory. So thinking about democracy and difference, interestingly, when you think about deliberative democracy, which is the mainstream model of one of the mainstream models of thinking about democracy beyond the nation state, so there is a disagreement between scholars who think that the best solution for global democracy would be if people speak their own local language, their vernacular, and those who think we need English or another global language to make democracy work. And here are the arguments. So first, the multicultural perspective is the one that wants people to speak in their local language. And I quote Will Kimlicker's argument. The average citizen feels at ease only when he discusses political questions in his own language. As a general rule, only elites are fluent in more than one language and feel at ease discussing political questions in different languages in a multilingual atmosphere. End of quote. So Kimlicka is really concerned about post-colonial power structures and about global elites, whom he argues are multilingual. Sociologists think about that differently, and the argument here is that we have many working class people who are multilingual. We also have multilingual democracies like African states and India, nevertheless. So on the other side, you have cosmopolitan democratic theory and deliberative democratic theory. And so here the point is that we need one language. Otherwise, we don't have transparent, egalitarian, and inclusive global decision-making or communication. And the argument is made, for example, by Daniele Archibugi, who argues, I quote, "In the face of common problems, cosmopolitanism seeks to remove linguistic barriers, even if this implies that some members of the population who are not fluent in the language used for public purposes might be somehow disadvantaged." So here, in a way, a common public space, transparency is more important than inclusivity. And what I criticize about these two perspectives is that, from a sociological perspective, is that we know that no national language is open to everyone in the same way. A national language, we know since Bourdieu, is composed of many sociolects, class languages, dialects, and what's even more interesting, also in the multicultural perspective by Kimlicka, we would need to sit in separate groups, each in our own idiom. So the working class people have to sit with the others, then the Native Americans. But also these small groups are exclusionary, we know that. And you already have these civic meetings like in Hamburg. We're already in multilingual settings that are super unequal. We are diverse. So how do we deal with these situations? Neither the English lingua franca model nor the vernacular model offer practical solutions to them, but the activists actually practice it. So are the activists successful with their political translation or not? And what are the conditions? That's what I'm trying to answer this question in the book, or trying to start answering it. So political translation is a middle perspective between these two political theories. It's also an empirical practice. So I'm making a theory based on what's actually happening. And it's bringing us beyond the idea of linguistic difference to think about democracy more broadly as cultural difference. And it's interesting. We all agree that linguistic difference, if it's radical, we can't understand each other, it requires a translation. So how about religious differences? They sometimes need to be abolished, or cultural. You're not allowed to wear your headscarf. So how about, so language is an interesting entrance point into translation because it's acknowledged. Gender is not so easy. Translate your gender. How do you do that in a group? So the different practices of political translation that I talk about in the book can be used with more or less success depending on how much room and awareness is in a group, whether they have differences that are required to be translated or whether they don't want that and repress them. So that's, for example, important. So my work is based on the work of sociologists Pierre Bourdieu, Francesca Puleda, Betsy Leander Wright, and Leslie Wood, who all thought about cultural diversity in dialogical group settings. And now I'm going to present these several case studies. One is the European Social Forum, where I was interested in comparing European meetings that were multilingual and national meetings that took place in one language in 3 countries, Italy, Germany, and the UK. Then I went to the United States Social Forum, where the activists thought that they also translate differences of race, class, and gender, and I wanted to understand how they do that actually, what's the impact. And finally, I'll talk about multilingual local democracy in California, in a city of 300,000 inhabitants, where 70% of the inhabitants had been born outside the United States. And the city council was very progressive. They included linguistic interpreters in all of its meetings, all city hall meetings, but you had a competition between representatives acting as institutional political translators, speaking on behalf of the citizens and the residents, and activists. So I wanted to know which of these groups is better, which helps to democratize these meetings. How does it work? So for the political scientists among you, this is the research design with the number of case studies, where I'm interested in a variety of best cases, political translations addressing transnational, national, and local arenas, addressing different issues such as linguistic national differences, race, class, and gender differences, as well as differences between political representatives and ordinary people and class differences. So how does this connect to theories of translation? And that's the part where I want you to intervene eventually and discuss it. So for translation theorists, it's obvious that translation is political. And my work has been inspired by the work of Moira Inghillieri, Mona Baker, Julie Bourri, who also studied the social forums, and Antonia Castellan, who writes about translation and activism. And there's been other works like the work by Ngugi wa Thiong'o about translation as a language for democracy, and then the work by Maria Timotsko about the post-colonial struggle and engaged translation. So there's been done much more work than in the social sciences about translation. And people have been figuring out that translation is both, can be hegemonic and subversive. So what does political in the concept of political translation actually stand for? And here I connect my own work to the theory of Jacques Rancière, the French philosopher, who in his book, The Disagreement or La Mise-entente, talks about a very distinct kind of political misunderstanding, the one that I was trying to explain when I talked about the cake. This idea that some people want more of the cake, or those who have traditionally gotten more of it, it comes from Rancière's work on what he calls la mise-entente, the misunderstanding that's based on power inequality, and that has an elite group being unable and unwilling to listen to the non-elites. Rancière writes, for example, in his book, The Disagreement, I quote, "We should take disagreement to mean a distinct kind of a speech situation, one in which one of the interlocutors at once understands and does not understand what the other is saying, a kind of refusal to listen." And I take this work into deliberative democratic theory to talk about moments in which, in a meeting where everyone is protesting together and are now thinking about what will be the best strategy for protests, they all agree, still some people will be taken more seriously than others. And it often has to do with implicit power inequality and the incapacity of even facilitators who are supposed to be neutral to listen to members of disadvantaged groups. A lot of sociologists have always been talking about these difficulties. They talk about inequality and exclusion, informal leadership, but I want to really talk about misunderstanding and the communicative dimension of these processes. Here is my method. I can explain that later. I worked ethnographically, combining discourse analysis, interview, survey, and participant observation in meetings. And now I want to talk about the findings. So in the European Social Forum, I was interested in how inclusive, egalitarian, and transparent multilingual meetings would be in comparison to monolingual meetings. These meetings took place in across a period of 3 years, and they always involved the same conflict parties. People went to national meetings, quarreled, and went to European meetings to avoid that the bad decisions that had been made at the national level would be repeated, where they would quarrel again. So that was very practical for me. I traveled with them, and I looked at how they interacted and where their conflicts were solved more democratically, or what people perceived to be more inclusively, more transparently, more egalitarian, where conflict there was always, it was never perfect. So the countries I said were Italy, Germany, and UK. And what I found was that unlike my colleagues in social movement studies and democratic theorists had predicted, the European meetings were perceived by the wide majority of participants to be more democratic in this transparency, inclusivity, and equality kind of register that connects to deliberative democracy. They were also more inclusive on paper, since I did a discourse analysis of the decisions that the European and the national meetings took the same decisions. And the European ones, for example, included in high stakes decision making more migrants, more women, and more people whose organization were not as influential as the leading organizations. So as a result of that, the European meetings would survive over 10 years, and the national meetings would break down. The British, after 1 year, after a lot of quarrel and the police intervening into meetings after disruption, anarchists against Trotskyists, the Germans, because people didn't show up in meetings any longer, and the Italian meetings, they crumbled last after 3 years because they had facilitators who did a lot to make these meetings inclusive, but still there it broke down. So why were the European meetings more inclusive? That was my research question. So I just present a glimpse of the findings based on the interviewees whom I talked to. Here is Samira. She was a refugee from Iran and a German local activist. She described how the facilitators in national meetings ignored her arguments. I quote, "In national meetings, we migrant women are treated as if we were air. They talk about us, but not with us, even if we sit in the same room." End of quote. So Samira here describes a particular type of gendered intersectional misunderstanding, but she was part of a group of local activists, none of which was taken seriously by the national level facilitators, who were unionists and party leaders, while the local activists were more anarchists and feminists, so who had less resources. So you had a conflict between a leadership and a grassroots that couldn't be solved. The forum broke apart. In the UK, the situation was different. Particularly migrant women were included by the leading parties, the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party and another socialist party. However, anarchists and local activists felt excluded. Like Paul, who said, an anarchist from the UK, I quote, "European meetings are more democratic than national ones. Babel's translation reduces the hegemony of insiders. For newcomers, access gets easier." End of quote. So Paul, with the statement, made me attentive to that the interpreters who were just there to make meetings work did something counter-hegemonic. And I still, at the time when I did the interview, I was a student, I didn't understand really what was it about. Giulia, a feminist activist from Genoa who had founded the Italian Social Forum, said that also in Italy there were some issues, still different than in the UK and in Germany. I quote, "In Italy, it's always the same people who decide. Only bureaucrats who hold positions in organizations and tend to prefer talking amongst themselves and not with people who do not speak for a big organization." End of quote. So that's the classic in social movement, in the literature. The people with more power will talk among each other. In Italy, they all sat in Rome and they didn't listen to the grassroots feminists from northern Italy like Giulia. In my participant observation, I saw that interestingly, whenever consensus decisions in the European meetings tended to be particularly exclusive, so that the German national delegation, the Italian national delegation, and the French would make a deal among themselves, excluding all the Central Europeans, the Turks and the Kurds, to think about the women's organization. In those moments, the translators, the interpreters would intervene and they would perform a strike, as happened in a meeting in Paris where a major decision had to be made, and a lot of participants had already said the consensus is totally unfair. It's just the big countries, they are not countries, they're activist groups, but still, who make an unfair compromise. And the facilitator in that meeting, a unionist from France, Isabelle, she said, "C'est pas possible de changer le consensus. All the French organizations have already agreed. The unions, they had such a bad quarrel nationally. We cannot change this consensus. It's not possible. We will keep it. We will stick with it." And nobody could convince her, who was like, she was a school teacher, very like authoritarian in a way, but that's why she had this job to negotiate. And in that situation, the Babel stormed to the front from the invisible to the visible, and they said, we're gonna, oh, sorry. This is my car for tomorrow morning. So this was a disruption. So basically, the translators were able to disrupt meetings that nobody else would disrupt. They were seen as highly legitimate because they did all the volunteer work. They were diverse groups. They represented the forum and its idea of democracy across differences. And they left this position of just listening and not intervening to intervene and to disrupt. And 5 minutes after they had disrupted, the consensus was changed entirely, to the extent that the migrants, the German delegation took away its seats, gave it to several of its seats gave it to migrants. The Italian delegation said yes to a quota for women, and then the Italian feminists had wanted that, but then half of the speakers in all meetings were supposed to be women, so it was to the benefit of a lot of other people. And the British anarchists who felt suppressed by the Trotskyists also got their speakers in. Through a chain process of people speaking up after these translators had freed open the space by their capacity to disrupt. And situations like that happened in all European meetings. And they couldn't happen at the national level. Why? Because there wasn't a collective group of translators who was seen as necessary and who had a leverage to intervene. But you had individuals who tried to advocate or translate for locals in Germany and the women, the migrant women, or the anarchists in the UK, or the feminists in Italy, but they were unsuccessful. So something about the European level and its multilingual and diverse setting enabled the intervention of a critical third force, the translators. And that's who also then changed not only the outcome of decision-making, but also how participants like Isabelle, the woman whom I mentioned, whom you can see in this picture, that's Isabelle and that's Babel's interpreters. He's close to her ear. He's basically dialoguing with her, but at the same time also disrupting, or the group is also disrupting. In the background, you have the interpretation booths. So you have this double role of both bridging linguistically as well as disrupting, as well as cultural translation with the leaders. So this Isabelle told me in an interview after 3 years how interaction with the Babels had completely changed her own vision of cooperation, to the extent that she would now, at the national level, fight for the inclusion of migrant organizations with solidarity money. And she's a unionist, and you may know, like in France, as well as in other countries, cooperation between migrants and unions is always very contentious. So you see a true change. But it would not have happened had these translators just talked peacefully and not disrupted occasionally. So in democratic theory, it's really interesting to think about a group that can be both dialogue and persuade, like the interpreter at the ear of Isabel, as well as disrupt. It in a way brings together liberal democratic theory, which is more deliberation, persuasion, and radical democratic theory, which is about conflict and disruption, or nonviolent resistance, as Stellan Windhagen, that's one of the fields that you're working about. So that's why I think this practice is relevant for democratic theory. And so my question was, after having done this first study, which is the first chapter of the book, okay, could this whole thing also work at the national level, where we have a traditionally established monolingual setting, also in the United States? Could it also work with our current conflicts about race, ethnicity, and inequality? And in a setting with refugees coming in to already contentious societies in the North. So my second case study is the US Social Forum, which happened in 2003 in parallel to the European Social Forum, but it took much later to have its first national meeting. And the reason for that were conflicts about race, ethnicity, and inequality. Conflicts that were actually positional misunderstandings about race. Where in the very first meeting, where an American group tried to create a Midwestern social forum, a conflict about race led to Native American or indigenous groups leaving the forum. And when they left, other minority groups also left, so that the forum would be so delegitimate that it never took place. So in that moment, the philanthropic foundations who tried to host the forum or make it possible were ready to work together with this group, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and other activist groups who came from the civil rights movement. So they were people of color traditionally, or civil rights groups. They were the ones who, like Carla, whom I quoted, were translating between the national level, DC, and the local level, the undocumented migrants organizations, and the left-wing Democrats. And they saw their role of bridging these differences, which were class differences and status differences, and sometimes also linguistic differences for the migrants. They saw these differences as political, and they saw their own role as that of critical political translators rather than neutral brokers or something like that. So these activists, being entrusted by the funders with the power that if you host the forum, if you call it together, we trust you that you'll deal with the race issue better than the first group who tried to do it. They said, okay, to the funders, we do it, but we translate it. So we want a leadership group that's radically diverse. We don't want the representatives of the funders. If you think this is your assembly, it was about 70 people. We don't want that 60% of you here are representing the Ford Foundation and the so-and-so foundation and more what they called white collar activism, the NGOs. We want them to be local people, people from the region. They had the first forum was in Atlanta. We want them to be migrants, domestic workers, young people, people of color. And so the funders said, oh, that's really nice. So we won't give you the money because we don't trust these people. We don't have a relationship of cooperation with them. And seriously, they look like crazy radicals. And so there was a conflict because they tried to translate those other differences that are other than language, and they were explicit with it. So that's why the US Social Forum took much longer than the European forums that I studied, but it also was in many ways successful. So the first thing that happened was that the organizers of the forum said very blatantly that they were trying to make a small revolution. And here's another quote by one of the organizers. Who were they? What did they want? I quote, "I'm one of the youngest people of color in the International Council of the World Social Forum and a woman, and I feel there are many Latin American white men, most academics, and we wanted to change this in organizing the first US Social Forum. We used translation. If we hadn't worked with translation, the US Social Forum would have looked like any other space in the US left, old white men and Marxists in the majority." End of quote. So yeah, so here this is not an unbiased statement, right? And so the point is here that the idea is that there is a class difference in the left, and at the local level you have many more minorities, people of color, and more women or female identified participants. At the same time, you also have Christian churches who don't like to have, for example, a gender-neutral bathroom in a social forums building. So you also need to talk with them about why that would be important for queers. So there's a lot of conversations that these translators or self-organized, self-defined illustrators needed to make happen before they could even have people meet together. They organized gender justice trainings, they organized anti-racist trainings, and they forced everyone who wanted to be a leader to be part of that. That created a lot of frustration, especially among the elite of the movement, the academics who had been part of the civil rights movement and thought of themselves as feminists and anti-racist. So there was conflict because of political translation. Here is an example of some of these leaders in the German Social Forum and in the American Social Forum who had more difficulties with the gender justice issues. And what is interesting, I compare in the book the German and the US Social Forum because they had similar issues around conflicts about gender and ethnic minorities. The Germans decided to not address these issues, and they ended up with a social forum of 1,000 participants in their first edition. And in the second edition, they had only 500 participants in a country with 80 million. In the US, the first US Social Forum had 10,000 participants, almost without funding because of the conflict. And the second had almost 20,000 participants. So they had succeeded to double the number of participants, which is really unusual for such a big country where the movements in the left are so divided. And the second US Social Forum took place in Detroit. So it was also, many people didn't want to go there. So a lot of mobilization and convincing persuasion had to happen. In Germany, the Social Forum took place in Erfurt, which is in the east of Germany. So the minorities didn't want to go because the city was known to be on the racist side. It wasn't yet the years of Trump or of the likes in Germany. It wasn't as dangerous, but it wasn't in or Frankfurt. And these were deliberate decisions by the leadership that worked with or without political translation. So on the left side, you have a quote by a German Social Forum facilitator, one of the main leaders. And he told me after 6 years of Social Forum work, I quote, "I still don't know why we have not been able to become friends in the German Social Forum National Organizing Group," end of quote. So the issue here was that he wanted to be friends with the migrant women and the local activists, but it didn't happen. Mobilization broke down, but he didn't know why. So what I show in the book is that these positional misunderstandings, conflicts that happen in meetings that are for some people very open and loud, for others are never fully conscious or they suppress their own role in them. So this facilitator had been involved in choosing the location, suppressing the minority women, and so on, but wasn't aware of it. He actually wanted to make friendship. On the other side, you have a quote by a US Social Forum leader who felt really uncomfortable with these new gender justice and anti-racist workshops that he had to go through to be a leader. And he said in this quote, "I had never before in my life worked in an organization with people of color. And then this is ... but he told in the interview, it felt also weird. There were these workshops and he reflected about them. And then he said, okay, anyhow, now I've made friends with others, it no longer matters, end of quote. So the it no longer matters, this is the race thing, race no longer matters. So I wanted to confront these two quotes because Francesca Poletta in social movement studies has written a lot about friendship in the left, and you can connect it to Bourdieu. Friendship is connected to our class status, to our ideology. We are not friends with people whose ideologies we find terrible, or sometimes also whose differences we can't support. So what's interesting is that the American activists who founded the US Social Forum, they went beyond their taste. So to translate for them meant to transform racialized and gendered hierarchies and identity-based conflicts. So this is again a quote by Carla, whom I quoted initially. She said, organizing the social forum for me was the hardest thing I've ever done. People who are very, very diverse and people you would never interact with. Just because I'm a woman of color and queer does not mean I'm always right. The process is learning that. End of quote. So in this interview, she also told me about how she would have never been friends with these people and that her girlfriend told her, oh, they don't call it a struggle for nothing. So different groups experienced the social forum preparatory process as very hard, but they connected and they created a coalition across differences of race and class, and also identity and ideology. And so here are two activists who are transgender. One of them is identifies as woman of color. So the social forum people had people with these identities be leaders in meetings, and that didn't happen on its own. This is 10 years ago. It was very new in the American left, and they did a lot of organizing work to make it possible, to also avoid that hate crimes would happen, also with the gender neutral bathrooms, no police or security forces would intervene. It was a very radical space that created a lot of enthusiasm. So the social forum grew, even though it didn't have a lot of funding. So to conclude, I want to give you insights from my last case study on the city in California, where two different groups tried to politically translate democracy. The first were the city council, three progressive city council members in the city who had run for office encouraged by NGOs, and they wanted to represent Latino vote. And they were bilingual, children of migrants. They said, we slept on the floor as children, so we really know it, we represent you. However, once they were in office, they took decisions that were perceived as exclusionary, especially by the local resident migrants, and there was evidence of political corruption. So even though they had come from the people, they had become corrupted. So you had, even though this is a newspaper extract, you had situations in meetings where the local resident migrants and citizens complained about these institutional political translators who spoke as if they were the group they supposedly translated or represented. So translation becomes representation and it fails. So in that moment, and they had the linguistic interpreters in the background, but they also thought they can also, since they're bilingual, they could also translate residents' demand. So you have this weird mix of representation and an idea of translation. In the same city and in the meetings that were perceived as very exclusionary, you had community translators. And so Moira Inglieri has written about the work of this group. They are often very young in California. Many come from migrant families. It's not the people here, these are just activists. And they were organizing an alternative community forum in the same city where they would invite the representatives as well as the churches and the local participants and residents, and they would train local residents to become their own leaders and facilitators so that they could be on an egalitarian base with representatives and have discussions with them. So you have the representative and the resident, and the resident represents so the resident speaks for a community. She's a community leader. She speaks in Spanish, and the representatives understand Spanish but answers in English. So you have a bilingual space that's confrontational and where the community, with its own leaders, but also with people in the audience, discusses with the politicians what they want. And the community translators, all that they do is they stop the politician from taking over and bridging the enormous status and class difference, and they disrupt. But the disruption isn't seen as a disruption because they're just translating. So in that meeting space, political negotiation and its outcomes changed towards what the residents wanted, while at City Hall, political decision-making was perceived as very exclusionary. So in this last case, I'm basically clarifying what are the conditions for the success or the failure of political translation. One is that it fails if it's only linguistic interpreting, and it fails if it's done by people in high status and power positions like these representatives. Political translation is a self-consciously organized disruptive practice, and it's more than mediation or intercultural facilitation. So I also argue in the book that political translation needs a movement. The more diverse, the better. And individual attempts of translation, political translation failed in the cases where I observed. But that's just the first kind of departure for discussion. What's interesting is that the impact of political translation and acted decision-making that were fair and legitimate in the perspective of participants of meetings, but it wasn't the translators themselves who changed it. It was their interventions that made leaders change decision-makings that they would otherwise not have changed. And so for social movement theorists, this position of the third, the critical disruptive third, the translator, is interesting because it combines the more deliberative and liberal democratic theory and the radical democratic theory. It's based on these mechanisms of disruption and persuasion, which don't often go together in political theory. And it depends on the leverage of cross-cultural translators' position. So if you think that your group is homogeneous, you won't be able to work with it. And so the third position in democratic theory has been either theorized as neutral facilitation, or that in social movement studies, it's been assumed to be instrumental brokers, people who are just strategic. And here you have somebody who is a moral actor, not just strategic and not neutral. So for democratic theory, political translation creates a middle ground to think about democracy and difference in a productive way, beyond the idea of cosmopolitanism needing just one lingua franca, or us having to be separate in our small communities, and to also think about culture more broadly speaking, beyond linguistic differences, to consider other differences as well. So Carolyn Schredt and I discussed about this earlier, and Carolyn reads this book as also as a book that breaks the paradigm, the monolingual paradigm, in a lot of research and I think policy, to propose a way how democracy in these times of crises, can work without us having to go back to the past. So yeah, that's maybe good to think about it right before the midterms. In Hannah Arendt's term, power is not what one person holds over others. That's violence for her. Power is only what we share, what we have with others. But she's not very concrete on how that can happen. So political translation is not just a technique, it's a model on how to realize democratic power and deliberation in settings of diversity. So in Arendt's terms, it realizes this power with. And there are more sociological theories that I contribute to. So maybe the most interesting thing is that, that there have been other people thinking about how translation could work in the US education system. Prudence Carter talks about multicultural straddlers in the US education system. And Michelle Amond and Sada Aksatova talk about ordinary people as cosmopolitans. But in sociology, this is the first study on positional misunderstandings that I know of in relation to political translation. There is the study by Betsy Leander Wright, who talks about class differences, how they create misunderstandings. So I would add the idea of translation in addition. And so my current research is on whether this matters at all in Europe, in the refugee solidarity movement, and whether political translation can be also done by people who aren't leftist activists or super conscious community translators, but are, for example, a Bavarian monk who translate for a gay Syrian refugee in front of a really contentious asylum interview. Would there be any leverage in these hard policy situations that Moira Ingalera has been studying? And whether and if solidarity coalitions themselves need translations, political translations, and how they operate and how they fail. So that's my current work, and yeah, I'm just at the beginning. Thank you very much for your attention.